What if I told you a single piece of audio just shattered one of the most powerful political movements in America? Not a tweet, not a headline, not fake news, but a real recording played out loud in a courtroom that made jurors freeze. Reporters gasp and supporters suddenly go silent. This wasn't an opinion, it was evidence, and it changed everything in seconds. Inside that courtroom, something rare happened. Donald Trump sat with his eyes closed, swaying slightly, as his own voice echoed through the room. No spin, no filter, just raw audio revealing conversations his entire defense depended on denying. Even longtime allies couldn't look at each other. The energy shifted instantly, and everyone felt it. This wasn't just a bad day in court. This was the moment denial collapsed, narratives broke, and reality took control. And by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why this moment sent shockwaves through MAGA and why there's no going back now. For years, deniability was the strongest shield protecting Donald Trump. Whenever allegations surfaced, the response was always the same. I didn't know, I wasn't involved, that's fake news. That strategy worked in rallies and interviews, but it collapsed instantly the moment prosecutors pressed play in that courtroom, because this time it wasn't a witness talking about Trump, it was Trump himself doing the talking. When the audio began, the room reportedly went dead silent. Jurors leaned forward, no one moved, and then they heard Trump's unmistakable voice discussing payments, financing, and how to structure a hush money deal. This wasn't vague or accidental, this was direct participation. In simple terms, the defense had spent years arguing Trump was distant from the scheme. While the recording proved he was actively involved in planning it, that single moment wiped out the core of his legal defense. This is why recordings are so devastating in court. You can argue with people, you can attack motives, you can question memory, but you cannot argue with audio. Jurors don't need experts to explain it. They hear it with their own ears. And psychologically, that hits harder than any document or testimony. It feels real, personal, and undeniable. Once jurors hear the defendant's own voice discussing the alleged crime, the case stops being theoretical. For MAGA supporters, this was a nightmare scenario. The movement thrives on mistrust of institutions, but you can claim bias against a recording. There's no anchor to blame, no article to dismiss, just sound playing out loud, removing every layer of protection. This wasn't media spin, this was reality speaking for itself, and it shattered everything that came before it. One of the most overlooked details in high-profile trials isn't what's said, it's how the jury reacts. And in this courtroom, their reaction told a story that no legal analyst could spin. When prosecutors played the recording, jurors didn't fidget, they didn't whisper, they didn't look bored. According to courtroom observers, they went completely still. Pens paused, eyes locked forward. That kind of focus is rare, and it signals that something important just landed. Jurors are trained, both formally and informally, to read credibility. They watch faces, listen to tone, and notice hesitation. But when audio evidence enters the room, their role shifts. They're no longer judging who to believe, they're processing what they just heard. In this case, they heard Donald Trump discussing the mechanics of a payment scheme in his own voice. It transforms jurors from skeptics into witnesses. And once jurors feel like witnesses, the case takes on a different weight entirely. What made this moment especially damaging was the contrast. On one side, prosecutors calmly let the audio speak. On the other, the defense had nothing to interrupt it. No objection that could erase what jurors already absorbed. The silence in that room wasn't neutral, it was absorbing. The jurors were forming conclusions in real time, connecting dots without being told what to think. That's every prosecutor's dream and every defense attorney's nightmare. For MAGA supporters watching from the outside, this is hard to grasp. Public opinion is loud and emotional. Jury decision-making is quiet and methodical. There are no chants, no applause, no outrage, just listening. And in that moment, as the jury sat motionless and attentive, it became clear the case had shifted. Not because of politics, but because the people who decide guilt had just heard something they could never unhear. For nearly a decade, one phrase has acted as a panic button for controversy: fake news. Whenever damaging information surfaced, it could be waved away as bias, exaggeration, or a coordinated attack. That tactic worked wonders on cable news and social media, but inside a courtroom, it has zero power. And this moment exposed that weakness in the most brutal way possible. When the recording played, there was no headline to argue with, no reporter to accuse, no network to blame. There was only sound, clear, uninterrupted, and undeniable. Jurors weren't being told what to think. They were simply listening, and that's the nightmare scenario for any defense built on doubt and distrust. You can challenge a journalist's credibility, but you cannot cross-examine a recording. This is where the political world and the legal world collide and separate. In politics, repetition can beat facts. In court, evidence beats narratives every time. The recording stripped away the comfort of disbelief and forced reality into the room. For supporters used to dismissing allegations as media attacks, this was disorienting. There was nothing external to fight against. The source wasn't Tam. The source was Donald Trump himself. What made this especially damaging is that the defense couldn't even reframe it in real time. Once jurors hear something with their own ears, you cannot rewind their understanding. The damage is already done. That's why seasoned legal experts often say audio evidence is a trial killer. Not because it's dramatic, but because it's final. For MAGA, this was a turning point. The movement thrives on skepticism of institutions, but skepticism collapses when there's nothing left to doubt. No spin, no filter, no interpretation, just a voice speaking plainly, cutting straight through years of denial. And in that moment, the most reliable shield they had simply stopped working. For years, Michael Cohen was dismissed as unreliable, disgraced, and self-serving. That reputation wasn't an accident. It was part of a long-running strategy to make sure that if Cohen ever talked, no one would listen. But in this courtroom, something critical changed. Cohen wasn't standing alone anymore. He wasn't asking for trust. He was being backed up by Trump's own voice, and that transformed everything. The moment the recording played, Cohen stopped being just a witness and became a bridge to hard evidence. Suddenly, his testimony wasn't about memory or motive. It was about context. He wasn't telling jurors what happened. He was explaining what they had just heard. That distinction matters enormously. Juries are trained to be cautious with witnesses, but when a witness aligns perfectly with audio evidence, credibility skyrockets. Cohen didn't need jurors to like him. He only needed them to understand the tape. The body language in the room said more than words ever could. Cohen stared straight ahead. No smirking, no reactions, no eye contact with Donald Trump. Trump, meanwhile, avoided looking at the man who recorded him. Two former allies sitting feet apart, completely disconnected. That silence between them wasn't coincidence. It was acknowledgement. Both men knew the balance of power had shifted, and it wasn't shifting back. For MAGA supporters, this was deeply unsettling. The narrative had always been simple: Cohen lies. But now, Cohen didn't need to convince anyone of anything. The recording did the convincing for him. His role was no longer accusation, it was confirmation. And that's the most dangerous position a witness can occupy. Once Cohen became a narrator of Trump's own words, attacking his character stopped mattering. The usual talking points lost their force because when a so-called untrustworthy witness is validated by objective evidence, the entire strategy of dismissal collapses. And in that moment, Cohen became impossible to ignore. Timing is everything in law, and this is where the situation went from embarrassing to legally explosive. The recording wasn't from years after the election or during some vague business dispute. It was made just weeks before voters went to the polls. That single detail changes how everything is interpreted because it directly ties the actions discussed on tape to election influence, not personal damage control. In simple terms, this wasn't about protecting feelings or privacy. Prosecutors argued it was about protecting a campaign. When jurors learned the conversation happened at a moment when every headline, every scandal, and every news cycle could sway undecided voters, the intent became impossible to ignore. This is where the courtroom logic became especially dangerous for Donald Trump. If the payment had happened years earlier, the defense could lean on personal motives. But when the discussion happens under the pressure of an active presidential campaign, it starts to look strategic. Jurors don't need law degrees to grasp that suppressing damaging information right before an election benefits one thing. Above all else, winning. For MAGA supporters, this detail is often overlooked or minimized, but inside the courtroom, it's critical. Election-related timing transforms actions into intent. It tells jurors why something was done, not just what was done. And once intent enters the picture, the legal stakes rise dramatically. The recording locked that timing into place. It froze the moment. Prosecutors didn't need to speculate about motives. They let the calendar do the work. Dates, context, and urgency combined into a narrative that felt logical, grounded, and unavoidable. That's why this moment hit so hard. It wasn't just evidence of an act, it was evidence of purpose. And when jurors connect purpose to power, the case stops being political and starts being personal. Every criminal defense needs a simple, believable story, and for years, this was the one Trump relied on. I didn't know what was going on. Michael Cohen acted on his own. That argument wasn't flashy, but it was effective because without direct proof, plausible ignorance can create reasonable doubt. The problem, the recording didn't just weaken that defense, it destroyed it completely. When jurors heard Donald Trump asking questions about payments, discussing structure, and engaging in the mechanics of the deal, the idea that he was out of the loop instantly became unbelievable. This wasn't a quick yes or no conversation. This was participation. And in criminal law, participation equals responsibility. You don't need to sign paperwork to be accountable. You just need to be involved. What made this so damaging is how cleanly the tape contradicted Trump's public claims. Defense teams can survive weak witnesses. They can survive bad optics. What they cannot survive is evidence that directly conflicts with their own narrative. Jurors are always looking for consistency, and once they detect a contradiction, trust erodes fast. The recording created that. Contradiction in the most undeniable way possible. This is also where juror psychology comes into play. People don't like feeling misled. When jurors realize a defendant's public story doesn't match private behavior, it triggers skepticism not just about one claim, but about everything else the defense says afterward. That's how a single piece of evidence starts poisoning the well. For MAGA supporters, this moment was jarring. The familiar talking point, he didn't authorize it, suddenly had nowhere. To stand, the tape answered the question before anyone could ask it. At that point, the defense wasn't defending anymore, it was reacting, and in a courtroom, reaction is usually a sign that the fight is already being lost. For years, denial wasn't just a reaction for MAGA supporters, it was a strategy. Allegations could be brushed off. Investigations could be labeled political. Witnesses could be smeared. As long as there was uncertainty, belief could survive. But the courtroom doesn't run on loyalty or outrage. It runs on clarity, and the recording erased the one thing denial needs to exist: doubt. When jurors heard Donald Trump speaking plainly about the payment, the usual escape routes vanished. There was no room to reinterpret tone, no missing context to argue over, no third party to blame. Denial depends on the idea that something else might be true. A clear recording leaves no something else. It pins reality to the wall and forces everyone in the room to confront it. This is where the psychological shock hit MAGA the hardest. Supporters are conditioned to question institutions, not their own ears, but audio evidence flips that dynamic. You don't need to trust the judge. You don't need to believe the media. You just need to listen. And once you do, denial becomes emotionally exhausting. Holding on to belief now requires ignoring reality instead of questioning it, and that's a much heavier lift. Inside the courtroom, that shift mattered. Jurors weren't debating theories. They were observing facts. Outside the courtroom, it created visible cracks. Talking points lost their punch. Deflections sounded hollow. Even staunch defenders struggled to explain away what couldn't be unseen or unheard. This wasn't a slow erosion, it was a sudden collapse. Denial works best in noise, chaos, and repetition. A quiet courtroom, a still jury, and a single recording stripped all of that away. And once denial failed, everything built on top of it began to wobble. Because when belief depends on disbelief, evidence is fatal. For decades, Donald Trump has relied on one powerful advantage: performance, charisma, dominance, control of the room, whether it was a rally, a debate stage, or a press conference. Trump thrived by overwhelming the moment, talking louder, attacking faster, and reshaping the narrative in real time. But the courtroom is the one place where that skill set means nothing, and this moment exposed that weakness completely. In court, there is no microphone to grab, no crowd to energize, no interruption to steamroll through. Trump couldn't talk his way out. He couldn't redirect attention. He couldn't turn anger into applause. He had to sit still and listen as evidence spoke for him. And when your brand is built on control, being forced into silence is devastating. The power dynamic flips instantly. What made this especially damaging was the contrast. Outside the courtroom, Trump projects confidence and certainty. Inside, observers described him as withdrawn, eyes closed, head swaying, disconnected. That visual matters. Jurors don't just hear evidence, they absorb presence. And presence that looks uncomfortable, passive, or defeated subtly reinforces the prosecution's case, even without a single word being spoken. For MAGA supporters, this is hard to reconcile. They're used to seeing Trump dominate spaces, not submit to them. But the legal system doesn't reward bravado, it rewards restraint, consistency, and facts. And in that environment, Trump's greatest strength became irrelevant. The rules were no longer his. This is why the recording hit so hard. It didn't just present evidence, it silenced the performer. There was no way to spin tone, no way to overpower the moment. The courtroom reduced everything to substance, and substance doesn't bend to personality. In that room, Trump wasn't a movement leader or media figure. He was a defendant. And once the performance ended, all that remained was evidence, calm, quiet, and impossible to interrupt. Up until that moment, everything about the case could still feel theoretical. Legal arguments, technical charges, complex timelines. For many people, especially outside the courtroom, crimes like falsifying records can sound distant, almost boring. But the recording changed that instantly. It turned an abstract accusation into a human moment. And once that happens, jurors stop thinking in legal terms and start thinking in real ones. When jurors heard Donald Trump discussing how to handle the payment, the crime suddenly had a voice, tone, and intention. It wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about decisions being made in real time. People planning, people choosing. That shift is powerful because jurors relate far more to actions than statutes. They understand conversations. This is where the prosecution gained something priceless: clarity. Instead of asking jurors to connect dots, the recording connected them automatically. The gap between accusation and reality disappeared. Jurors weren't imagining what might have happened. They were hearing what did happen. And psychologically, that creates a sense of certainty that's hard to undo. For MAGA supporters, this was another uncomfortable turning point. Many were able to dismiss the case as overblown or technical, but once the conversation itself became the evidence, that framing fell apart. It's much harder to argue that something is trivial when you can hear how seriously it was being discussed behind closed doors. In court, jurors aren't just deciding whether a law was broken. They're deciding whether a story makes sense. And once the story stopped being abstract and started sounding real, it became easier to believe and harder to ignore. And that's when a case becomes dangerous for a defendant. Because when jurors feel the reality of a crime, they no longer need convincing. They've already crossed the line from doubt to understanding, and they rarely cross back. What made this courtroom moment truly devastating wasn't just what happened, it was how familiar it felt. For jurors, this recording didn't appear in isolation. It landed on top of a growing pattern where Donald Trump's own words repeatedly become his biggest liability. When jurors recognize repetition, their thinking changes. One incident can be dismissed as a mistake, two can be explained away. But when similar behavior shows up again and again, especially involving recordings, statements, or documented conversations, it starts to feel deliberate. This recording didn't just prove involvement in one scheme. It reinforced the idea that Trump has a habit of saying the quiet part out loud, even when it carries legal risk. That's dangerous for any defendant. Jurors don't evaluate evidence in silos, and they build a mental picture over time, asking themselves a simple question: does this make sense based on what I've already seen? By the time this tape was played, the answer was already leading in one direction. The recording didn't need to persuade, it confirmed. For MAGA supporters, this is one of the hardest truths to confront. The belief that Trump is uniquely targeted falls apart when his own recorded behavior keeps surfacing as evidence. It forces an uncomfortable realization. These cases aren't built on misquotes or media distortion. They're built on verbatim moments Trump created himself. They were seeing consistency. And consistency is powerful because it feels intentional. It suggests awareness, not accident. And by the time the jury reached deliberations, this recording wasn't just proof of an act. It was part of a larger story about judgment, decision-making, and responsibility. And once jurors believe they understand who someone is, their verdict often follows naturally. That's why this moment mattered so much. It wasn't just damaging, it was confirming. And confirmation is what turns evidence into conviction.